This train, like most others, passes over hundreds of switches and crossings in its daily journeys. It is the job of the length gangs to keep these in good order. On all switch and crossing layouts, the first thing is to keep the fastenings tight, whether they are chair screws on bull-headed track or bolts and clips on flat-bottomed track. Bolts sometimes strip or crack at the shank. When this happens, they must be replaced. In flat-bottomed layouts, you will find many different kinds of base plates using bolts and chair screws together. All these must be kept tight. All switch and crossing work, however complicated, is built up of 3 units: switches, common crossings, and obtuse crossings. Each of these must be maintained in the proper way. First of all, switches. Switches are built up of stock rails, switch rails, slide chairs on whose surfaces the switch rails move, stretcher bars which hold the switch blades the proper distance apart, switch anchors which secure the ends of the switch rails to the stock rails, and the sole plate. Now take a look at the real thing. The switch blade is usually undercut. Notice that it is planed away to lie flush with the stock rail. Sometimes, however, it is straight cut, and the stock rail is joggled to make room for the square end of the switch blade. The stock rail bolts on switches must always be kept tight to keep the whole assembly firm. So must the stretcher bar bolts. The stretcher bars, remember, hold the switch blades the right distance apart. Notice that the first stretcher bar has an extension under the stock rail to prevent the switch lifting under traffic. Notice, too, the good fit of the blade against the stock rail. Keep an eye on the switch travel. This should measure 4 1/4 inches. Make sure there's no gap between the slide chair and the stop on the sole plate. Check the gauge at the toe of the switch. If the gauge is too wide, you will have to loosen the stock rail bolt and fit a slotted liner. It's quite simple. The cold chisel serves as a wedge to make room for the slotted liner, which is simply hammered in between the chair and the web of the rail. The liner forces the stock rail back into the correct position, and the bolt can then be tightened. Make sure the signal fitter is present when you have to adjust switches in this way to look after his side of things. When the job is done, the toe of the switch will once more be true to gauge. You will remember that the switch rails are anchored to the stock rail by switch anchors, which are secured to their rails by switch anchor bolts. These anchor bolts must not be allowed to work loose. If they are not kept tight, the switch may creep. If it does creep, loosen off the anchor bolts and the fish bolts. Now the switch is free and can be levered into square again. On flat-bottom switches, all the same rules apply, but notice that the blocks make switch anchors unnecessary. All switches must be cleaned and oiled regularly to ensure that they work properly. The next main component in any layout is the common crossing. It is built up of splice rail and point rail, secured together by splice bolts to make the V of the crossing. 2 wing rails, distance blocks which keep the wing rails in position, distance block and knuckle bolt at the knuckle. These preserve the correct distance between the wing rails. Once again, let's have a look at the real thing. The crossing nose has an extension at the foot which is secured by a saddle and a screw, or sometimes by a saddle and a bolt. This holds the crossing nose rigid under traffic. The crossing chairs are secured either with chair screws, chair bolts, or fang bolts. In all cases, they must be kept tight. The through bolts between the point rail and the splice rail must be kept tight. If they leak, as they sometimes do, they must be replaced by new ones. The splice bolts must not be allowed to work loose. If they do, then one or other of the rails may creep at the splice, and a gap will appear between them. The splice bolts should lie squarely across the V, parallel with this line. But the drive of traffic has shifted them, and they are now parallel with this line. To take up the creep, loosen off the splice bolts and the crossing through bolts. Slacken the fish bolts and drive out the keys. Then use a bar in the expansion gap to push the splice rail back into position, firmly butted up against the point rail. The splice bolts are square once more. The knuckle of the crossing is the point where the 2 wing rails come closest to one another before they diverge on either side of the crossing V. The knuckle gap is kept constant by a distance block between the 2 wing rails and a bolt. If this knuckle bolt is not kept tight, the wing rail may creep under traffic, and the knuckle bolt will be shifted from this line to this. To adjust wing rail creep, remove the crossing through bolts, drive out the keys, and remove the 2 furthest fish bolts. Then your bar behind the fish plate will swing the wing rail back into position. Sometimes a distance block wears and becomes loose. To deal with this fault, you will have to dismantle the crossing, so possession of the line must first be obtained. The ganger or his representative must sign for possession from the signalman. In addition, where the rules require it, a red flag must be placed in the forefoot and 3 detonators must be fixed to the rail at the proper interval. Now for the loose distance block. The ganger measures the wing rail clearance. This should be 1 3/4 inches. The through bolt must be removed and the bracket taken off. All other through bolts must be loosened and the keys driven out. Now a bar will swing the wing rail over enough to give space for the distance block liner. Then the keys can be driven back, the through bolt replaced, and everything tightened up. The liner has taken up the wear and the distance block is firm once more. The crossing is safe again for traffic and the line can be returned to the signalman's possession. Traffic is free to move again. Always keep an eye on the check rail clearance. It should be 1 3/4 inches. If it is wrong, a new check rail will have to be fitted. Take the gauge at the nose of the crossing and, if necessary, re-gauge the outer rails. Keep an eye on the behavior of the crossing under traffic. If the timbers move, then open up your ballast ready for packing. Use the big jack to lift the track. Spread your chippings evenly underneath the offending timbers. The amount of chippings must be determined by judgment. Away with the jack, square up the ballast, and the crossing will once more be properly supported in its bed. The third component of switch and crossing layouts is the obtuse crossing. A pair of these is found wherever one road crosses another. The crossing consists of 2 point rails, a wing rail shaped like an elbow, and a check rail. Notice that there is no splice rail. Obtuse crossings have 4 places where the gauge must be checked. In other respects, they must be maintained like common crossings. Keep an eye on the clearance at the knuckle gap. The correct distance varies according to the angle of the crossing. Flat-bottomed crossings are maintained in just the same way as bull-headed ones, whether they are common crossings or obtuse crossings. Keep them firm. Keep the fastenings and through bolts tight. Check the clearances and the gauge, and put them right if they're faulty. Where one road crosses another at an angle flatter than 1 in 8, the switch diamond layout is found. Watch this engine passing over a switch diamond. In switch diamonds, a special type of switch is used instead of an obtuse crossing. Watch them working. They operate like ordinary switches and must be looked after in the same way. When the nose or wing rail of a crossing gets badly worn, the welders must be called in to estimate the amount of wear and build the crossing up again. By welding metal onto the running surface and hammering out the profile, they can restore a crossing to its original shape and make it last much longer. Now let's go quickly through what you have seen. Keep the fastenings tight. Keep the stock rail bolts tight. Measure the switch travel. Keep an eye on the gauge at the toe of switches and fit a slotted liner when required. Keep switch anchor bolts tight. If the switches creep, loosen off and move them into square again. At crossings, keep an eye on the fastenings. Keep crossing through bolts tight, and if they break, replace them. Keep splice bolts tight. If there is creep at the splice, bar the offending rail back into position. Keep the knuckle bolts tight. Make sure distance blocks are firm. If they are worn and loose, fit a distance block liner. Keep an eye on the gauge at obtuse crossings and the knuckle gap clearance. Keep crossings firmly packed. And when they get worn, get the welders in. Everything that you have seen applies to all switch and crossing layouts, however complicated they are. The maintenance of switches and crossings is an important part of the length gang's job, and these simple practices which you have seen apply to all layouts wherever you may find them.